Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started. I am Will Burns. I'm co-director of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. And on behalf of the Institute, as well as our co-sponsors, the Program on Environmental and Energy Law at the Washington College of Law at American University, and the Environmental Policy and Culture Program at Northwestern University, I'd like to officially welcome you to the third annual Carbon Dioxide Removal Law and Policy Conference. What I'd say at the outset is that we've seen some amazing developments in the 3 years since we've started this conference, right? I think even only a couple of years ago, a lot of the discussion of carbon removal was largely notional, and many of the technologies were in extremely early stages of development with uncertain future. A lot has changed in the interim. There's been some major technological developments in both terrestrially and ocean-based approaches. There's been substantial increases in market support for these approaches, as well as much more interest and support in terms of the governmental sector, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe, Asia, and some other parts of the world. At the same time, when we look at notions of law and policy, there remain a lot of interstices, and there remain a lot of major questions about the overall integrity of the carbon markets themselves. And so those are some of the issues that we want to tease out today. What is the role, for example, of certification entities within this milieu, both in terms of helping to protect the integrity of carbon markets, as well as helping to facilitate and help scale carbon removal in the future? And then what are some of the important emerging regulatory issues? What are some of the important laws and regulations that may apply to carbon removal, are already being applied, may be applied in the future? What gaps are there that need to be addressed both at the international and domestic level? And in our last panel, what is the potential role for some so-called hard mandates that might help facilitate and scale carbon removal? I think we've got an exciting set of panels and participants, and I know we have a lot of people in the audience that will help stimulate the conversation. We'll also, incidentally, in our keynote address today by Joe Rahm, hear from a voice who's much more skeptical, probably than many in this room, about the role of carbon removal. And given his influence, and given the fact that he's not alone in terms of these sentiments, I think it's an opinion that we need to hear and engage with. And so I'm looking forward to that also. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Ben Rubin, who heads up the Carbon Business Council, to kick off the first panel. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Will, and to the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy for organizing this annual conference today. Very much looking forward to the discussion and participating and listening in through the whole agenda. It's a terrific group of speakers throughout the day. Great to see so many folks joining in. And yeah, looking forward to kicking off with this panel, which I think is a really great way for us to begin the day, to think through, as the panel is titled, the role of certification to ensure CDR integrity. So what we've seen over the last year is dramatic growth in the purchasing of carbon removal, more than a 400% increase in purchases from this time last year, from this time this year to when we compare it to last. But when we think about that growth, how do we continue that growth? And I think that comes with building trust as the market is growing, and really making sure that the certification is in place. So we've got a great group of panelists today to walk us through it. I'm joined for our morning panel by Daniel Sierra, who's the compliance director at Puro-earth, as well as Patricia Loria, who's the Vice President of Business Development at Carbon Capture Inc. And we have Liz Guinessey, who's the Manager for Food and Blue Carbon Innovation at Verra. So for the format of our morning panel, we're going to hear from each of our speakers. I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves so that you all have a sense of who they are. We're then going to hear from each speaker with a more in-depth presentation to talk through their perspective about the role of certification to ensure CDR integrity. And then we will open it up to questions from all of you. So as you hear speakers walking through their presentations, definitely take down notes or feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will make sure towards the end of our panel to open it up and hear from all of you. So I think to begin, before we go into presentation mode, just wanted each of our speakers to introduce themselves. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself and give us some opening thoughts about why you think certification is so key to ensuring CDR integrity. Patricia, let's start with you.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Patricia Loria. I'm the VP of Business Development at Carbon Capture Inc., which is a California-based direct air capture company. It's been a booming year, as you know, probably we've alluded to, a couple of years in terms of sale of carbon removal credits. These are pre-purchases for things that haven't been built yet, and we want to help ensure that the integrity of these purchases for our corporate buyers is there. And there's just a universal understanding of the value of these credits. You know, we've seen tumultuous marketplaces where corporations who have made purchases in, I think, the best faith, you know, have felt like those purchases now don't fulfill their goals and requirements as being part of the kind of climate change community. And we certainly don't want that to happen. But also, you know, I'll give this small, you know, tech company developer perspective. These first of a kind projects are really hard. And so, you know, looking at kind of certification and transparency on top of everything else we're doing sometimes kind of feels like a bit much. So, you know, certainly there are those tensions as well. But looking forward to the panel, Ben.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for those opening thoughts, Patricia. I think really helpful and great for folks to have a sense of your vantage point from Carbon Capture Inc. So thank you for that. Liz, if you can briefly introduce yourself and also tell us some of your opening thoughts about why this integrity is so important.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks everybody for being here today. I'm very excited for this panel and for all of the panels that are planned throughout the course of the day. My name is Liz Guinnessey. As Ben said, I am the Manager of Food and Blue Carbon Innovation at Verra. And so I've been at Verra for about 2.5 years, and my role there is to coordinate input for methodology development and for program updates for our VCS standard. And I'll go over some of those pieces during my presentation. But I think just to kick off and thinking about certification. So I sit within a standard setting body. So I think my perspective is a bit different from Daniel and Patricia. So it'll be very interesting to hear from them as well. But I think certification isn't just important, but must be required of any sort of removal claim, considering just how much is at stake for any of these claims when they're being made by some sort of corporate actor. And so I think in addition to that, you must have these robust quantification procedures, you must have a system for MRV, and then all of those pieces really need to be certified by an external and independent third party. But I do recognize that for some of these smaller startups, those things can be complicated, especially when you're investing money in research and then needing to invest additional money into that certification process as well. But those are just some opening thoughts. And again, very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, very much appreciate those opening thoughts. Great to hear from you. Looking forward to hearing more during your presentation. And Daniel, let's go over to you for a brief introduction and your opening thoughts as well.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Daniel Sierra. I just started this week in the role of Compliance Director at Puro-earth. So it is very interesting because my role now is going to be to make sure that all of the applicable rules are followed. And those are our internal rules, our general rules and methodologies, but also external rules such as our compliance to ICROA and ICBCM. So it is like a two-step verification system of complying with the rules of a standard and certifying and certification body. So I'm very happy to be here with you as moderator, with Patricia and Liz, and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and I think it's going to be a great conversation today, just with the different and complementary perspectives that you're each bringing to this, but to also hear all of the different ways in which to approach compliance, because it's not a single direction, but I think because you each have a different way of getting at compliance, it's going to be great for folks to hear from you. So we're now going to transition into the presentation phase of our panel. We're going to start with Daniel, then hear from Patricia, and then hear from Liz, where they're going to walk us through a more in-depth look at their insights. And then again, as a reminder for folks in the audience, we will turn it over to questions after the presentation. We want to hear from you, and we'll have some back and forth with our panelists. So Daniel, we'll turn it back to you to tell us a little bit more beyond your introduction about how we should be thinking about the role of certification to ensure CDR integrity. So we'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Ben. And good morning to everyone. I would like to start by thanking the Institute of Carbon Removal Law and Policy team that made this conference possible, and especially to Will Burns for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me and for Puro-earth to be speaking about the importance of carbon removal certification with such great panelists such as Patricia and Liz. And of course, you couldn't ask for a better moderator than yourself, Ben. So I'm very excited for the discussion ahead. Let me start my remarks by, with the commonly quoted phrase of the IPCC latest report, which is that carbon removal is unavoidable in order to reach the Paris Agreement temperature goals. And the word unavoidable is a very specific word. It hints to the fact that you would like to avoid it, but you can't. It talks to the dire state of our climate emergency. That reducing emissions won't be enough. We need to remove and sequester for long periods of time carbon from the air. Just a few years ago, this realization would have alarmed anyone paying attention. But today, we do have a beacon of hope, and it is the rapidly growing and evolving carbon removal industry. Thousands of carbon removal startups have sprung into existence in just a couple of years, trying new and different pathways, advancing science and lowering costs for the service they provide. Carbon removal, as Will mentioned in his opening remarks, is no longer the stuff of science fiction. It is a tangible and viable solution. However, the business model that guarantees the viability of these new companies is still untried, under development. Carbon removal is different from carbon avoidance and reduction in many ways, but there is one difference that I would like to highlight. And it is that all companies, all organizations for that matter, or persons, can reduce their emissions. Everyone can reduce their emissions, but only some companies will be able to remove carbon from the air. And that means that carbon removal needs to be provided by some companies to others, which is a convoluted way of saying that carbon removal needs a market to be able to exist as a solution, suppliers and buyers of a product or service. And all markets to thrive require one thing, and that is trust. Trust in that the product or service that you're buying is in effect what you're thinking you're buying. When you think of the product or service that a carbon removal company provides, you immediately understand the challenge. Carbon dioxide is an invisible, odorless gas, uniformly mixed throughout the atmosphere. And the service is to capture it and hide it for long durations of time. Well, this is why certification that this activity actually happened is so important. Certification provides the framework of trust. It is the linchpin that transforms carbon removal from a well-meaning concept into a verifiable and tradable service or commodity. Through rigorous and standardized assessments, certification ensures that each ton of carbon claimed to be removed from the atmosphere indeed is real, measurable, and is sequestered for long periods of time. Moreover, certification is fundamental not only for markets to thrive, in a framework of trust, but also in fostering innovation and investment. Investors and companies are more likely to allocate funds to solutions that have a certified impact. And by providing certified products, buyers can trust that what they're buying is in effect what they think they're buying, and this increases demand. This demand signal allows carbon removal companies to raise more funds, allocate resources for the development of diverse carbon removal technologies, drive costs down, and scale up the impact that they're having. Additionally, certification plays a crucial role in policymaking. It offers governments the data and confidence needed to integrate carbon removal solutions into broader climate strategies. This integration is essential for the creation of incentives and regulations that further support the growth of the carbon removal market. The voluntary carbon market won't solve the climate crisis, and this is clear. But what it can do is reach a magnitude that proves at scale what solutions work and are cost efficient for a future where governments will be the biggest buyers, as many expect this to happen. This integration of policymaking and voluntary markets today is essential for the success of this industry moving forward. But maybe more critically, certified carbon removal market is essential for public engagement. It provides citizens with the transparency needed to understand and assess the different projects and solutions, whether through individual action by purchasing credits or just making informed decisions in support of or criticizing companies that are active in this space. In conclusion, and to give space to the discussion ahead, certification is not just a fundamental element, it is the very foundation upon which the carbon removal market can thrive. And on this, I support what Liz said in her opening remarks. It instills confidence, drives innovation, guides policy, it involves the public. As we endeavor to solve the monumental challenge of climate change, let us recognize and support the role of certification in catalyzing a robust and effective carbon removal market. And with this, I yield the floor back to you, Ben, and looking forward for the discussion.
Daniel, thank you so much for those opening thoughts, and great to hear about your vantage point for certification, how important you think it is in your role at Puro-earth. Really appreciate those opening remarks from you. Patricia, we'll turn it over to you to hear a little bit more from your thoughts about how carbon capture and a company working on supplying carbon removal is thinking about certification. So feel free to take it away.
Can you see my presentation?
We can, yes.
Great. Hold on. I no longer see my presentation. Here, I'm gonna stop sharing a second and reshare. I'm sorry. You know what I think? Hold on. Okay. So my name is Patricia Loria, as I explained earlier, and we're going to share some insights on what we're learning from both projects and customers. As I said, you know, we have already been selling carbon removal credits to date to our customers. And a little bit more about us. We are a modular direct air capture machine. I'll explain briefly what that means coming up. We're still a small team. We're about 60 people and growing. We have announced a project Bison, and that's in Wyoming, and we were awarded DOE funds to help support that project as well. So it's been kind of a very dynamic year of both corporate and government support for direct air capture, specifically in the carbon removal space. And, you know, why we do this, and we've talked, I think about this, and obviously I don't need to prove this conversation to, I think, anyone who's attending, but I think what matters here is for us, this is a opportunity, right? As a tech developer, we have to sell our board and future investors that there is money to be made from this space. And, there are some who estimate that this market's, $1 trillion. And it's not just for putting CO2 into the ground, but there are other durable solutions like CO2 into concrete. And then there's also other non-durable solutions that also have a market opportunity, such as synthetic aviation fuels. And so, this is important because as we talk about, how we view standards, for us, we have to really think about this flexibility for the different use cases we'll see for direct air capture over the coming years. And also, does it allow us to sell at, these amounts? Is it part of the solution that customers are buying? And, I think Daniel talked very eloquently about this point, is that, the buyers are essentially buying trust that CO2 will be removed and stored permanently. And that, in our case, and that the CO2 that we used to make our, carbon removal credits was actually less than what it took to put those kind of credits in the ground, which is like the life cycle analysis. So, those conversations are all really important to us as we, talk through sales of carbon removal credits to our buyers. Again, just for people who don't understand, there are a bunch of different DAC technologies. What we do is a temperature vacuum swing absorption desorption process. It's a de-risked technology that has been used in multiple ways over the years in different industries. But essentially, we run air over a solid sorbent, which attracts that air. We then heat that solid sorbent up in order to desorb the CO2 from that solid sorbent, and then we cool it and kind of do the whole process again. So, this process does take a considerable amount of energy. And so how we talk about energy and energy additionality is certainly important to our buyers and important to how do we think about kind of certification frameworks. And another kind of point, I think that's kind of specific to us is, ultimately our technology are building blocks, right? So each reactor goes into a modular, which goes into a cluster, which goes into arrays, and we keep building those over time. Now, different modules could be different generations and actually have different capacities. And so, all of that will also need to be addressed when we're looking at kind of a full project methodology, where we might have different modules that have different life cycle analysis because of, what was, they're kind of amine based and how they're taking CO2 out of the air. That flexibility is another thing we think about when we think about certification frameworks. I started my presentation with just saying, I wanted to share a bit of that developer thought. And, I've been with carbon capture for 2 years. And when we first, announced Project Bison, I think we were a little naive as to what it will take to create these large infrastructure projects. And certainly, energy is probably one of our biggest issues. And part of that is, how do we match what we call above and below the ground resources, right? So we're looking at geological storage as the modality for, say, a megaton plant, because utilizing carbon in those, amounts right now isn't particularly feasible with things like, CO2 into concrete. But then when we look at places where we can do geological storage, they're often in rural lands. And so is there the energy, even that you need, that's not additional, right? Does it have the transmission lines and the substations need to power, a DAC facility? But then as we go forward, it's really important to us that we're bringing additional clean energy onto the grid so that we're not competing with grid decarbonization, which, I think Ben made those remarks in the beginning, that ultimately we're just one piece of how you address climate. And in the coming years, probably not the largest piece. Grid decarbonization is certainly a high priority item. And so, we need to think about that from a project perspective. Certainly, community engagement is also incredibly important to us. and not necessarily kind of reflected in, certification standards specifically, partially because, that's a little bit harder to quantify and standardize. But, we have spent, we've done 3 town halls in Wyoming. Even before we announced the project, we were engaged in the community. And certainly, we think that's valuable. We know our customers want to reward that for us, but not sure, exactly how to put it into, kind of standards or certifications. So right now, we have our own proprietary project design document that we developed based on conversations or looking at different standards, both from kind of Puro and the CCS Plus and ACR's kind of CCUS standard. We've been working with DNV as well to kind of modify that. And our goal is to have an ICRO approved standard. That is what our customers are requiring. I would say some customers don't care. If we were to create a proprietary standard and get, I would say industry approval, they are not so concerned about ICROA. But given that we do have some customers who are, we have to kind of come to that middle ground. And in some ways, each customer requirement becomes the minimum bar because, we'll have one kind of standard that covers all. So even if one customer doesn't care about something like ICROA certified standards, every customer is going to get it because it's a requirement for some. And certainly, for us, I talked about the fact that we have these different modalities: geological storage, mineralization, sustainable aviation fuel. Choosing a standard that allows us to have that flexibility when we look at those, kind of different portions of a project is really important. I think what's also important is we do believe that DAC can become kind of a gold standard of carbon removal because of the transparency of the system. With flow meters, we know exactly what we're taking out of the air. We can monitor all the energy that we're using and all the CO2 that's being produced as a result of our process in our LCA. We could show what's being sequestered underground, and there's robust monitoring, reporting, and verification for geological sequestration in Class 6 wells as a result of the federal EPA program. So, we think all of that demonstrates a lot of value for buyers, and we want to make sure that any standard is kind of demonstrating that durability and kind of rewarding DAC for, potentially its, highest class durability. Additionally, as I've discussed, energy additionality is really important to our customers. I think for different CDR pathways, that additionality, so on BECCS, it might be a question of kind of land use. So how do we make sure that that's kind of being incorporated in a way that really is accessible to our buyers? So those are all things that, we try to incorporate in our proprietary standard. But the fact is, we do want to come to an industry consistent standard. We'd like for, all kind of DAC players to be, singing from the same hymn sheet, because we think that that's really important to customers to be able to look at that consistency. And so, we are kind of monitoring what's going on with other industry players. Certainly, Climeworks has announced its relationship with Puro, and that certainly means a lot. We're looking at what others like Carbon Engineering is going to do, because we think that consistency is also important for the industry. So just, a couple other closing points. Other things we think about is, right now we have probably sold close to $100 million worth of credits without, a certification standard. And so as we're looking at some certification standards that are volumetric based and would be kind of retroactive on things already sold, as we kind of bring those into the standard, that becomes kind of a real cost to us. And so, I think we would look at standards, more favorably that weren't volumetric based, that were more kind of one-time fees. But that's, certainly something that we're kind of continuing to explore. There's also the kind of question of who bears the cost of the MRV as well, and kind of auditing and certification. And so, that kind of remains an ongoing question. And I think it all kind of comes down to kind of my last image here is I think we are all doing this because, you know, we want to really address this great challenge of climate change. And that's why our customers are doing it as well. And so, you know, these events are certainly, you know, uber critical in terms of making sure that industries are aligned and building that trust, so that, you know, we don't see some of the challenges, you know, we've seen previously, with, you know, offsets that didn't deliver on those promises and maybe set us back from addressing kind of the climate challenges that we're facing. We certainly don't think that we will, you know, have that problem, but, you know, want to make sure that we're providing that kind of transparency to ensure our customers understand that as well. And I'll stop sharing from that.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So helpful to hear your perspective. And really, I think some of those final points you were making about thinking through the complexities of retrospective certification, what to do for the carbon removal credits that have been sold, and some of the large, and this overall importance you're stressing of how to build trust in the market. Certainly, I think great table setting and context as we embark on the day-long event that the Institute for Carbon Removal on Policy has organized. So let's hear from Liz before we start having more of a back and forth dialogue to get into Liz's perspective on all this. Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so I will be talking about Verra's Verified Carbon Standard, or the VCS, and then kind of quickly talking about some of our existing and emerging opportunities for coastal and marine CDR, which is a bit of a different perspective from what Patricia just presented on. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of a diverse look at some of these CDR opportunities. And so throughout my presentation, I'll introduce Verra. I'll then introduce the Verified Carbon Standard and then provide that overview of those CDR opportunities that I mentioned. And so Verra is an environmental nonprofit. We were founded back in 2007 by different environmental and business leaders who saw a need for greater assurance of transactions that were occurring in these voluntary carbon market settings. We have over 160 staff. We have a headquarters in Washington, D.C., but we have staff really all over the world. I'd say about 60% of our staff is external to North America at this point. And so the main thing that Verra does is manage and operate different standards that are globally applicable and that span a really wide range of sectors and activities as well. We operate the Verified Carbon Standard, which is the world's largest voluntary greenhouse gas standard. And I'll provide some more details on that in some future slides, but I just want to mention some of the other standards that we operate. We have a jurisdictional and nested RED standard, which is essentially an accounting and verification framework for jurisdictional RED programs, reducing emissions from forest degradation and deforestation. We also have a climate, community, and biodiversity standard, or CCB. This standard can be used to credit beyond carbon benefits like improvements to livelihoods or biodiversity conservation. We operate a Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, or the SD-VISTA, which is a standard that tracks progress towards achieving Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And then finally, our newest standard is the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, which incentivizes recycling and reductions in plastic waste as well. And so now I want to get into the VCS and provide some more details on that program. This is probably not new to anyone here today, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, a carbon credit represents a reduction or removal of 1 metric ton of CO2 or its equivalent in another greenhouse gas like methane or nitrous oxide. Carbon credits can have benefits for communities, for biodiversity, for sustainable development goals, and carbon credits are recorded and retired on registries as well. And so the VCS, or the Verified Carbon Standard, consists of the standard itself, which is a set of rules and requirements that all projects must follow. The VCS has a set of accounting methodologies, and these methodologies cover different activities within the energy space, within the land use space as well. These methodologies not only include steps to quantify baseline and project emissions, but they also include procedures for demonstrating additionality, for project boundary requirements. They include procedures for quantifying leakage emissions from an intervention to reduce impact. They have steps to guarantee permanence, and they also offer guidance for monitoring. The VCS includes a system of independent auditing where third-party validation verification bodies will audit projects to ensure that those reported emission reductions and removals are real. And then finally, there is a registry system where all transactions are publicly posted, and any registration, issuance, and retirement of VCUs or verified carbon units are tracked, and anyone can look at that information. And so the role of standards is to really try to ensure that credits that are generated have the attributes that are listed here on this screen. So it's important that a carbon credit is real, that it's measurable and permanent. It's important that a carbon credit is additional or that it goes beyond business as usual. Carbon credits should be independently verified, transparently listed, and uniquely numbered. And they should also be conservatively estimated, which is in line with ISO 1464. And so in terms of some of the ongoing initiatives to ensure the integrity of carbon credits, again, I'm sure many on this call today are aware of these ongoing initiatives, but I just want to mention them. So on the supply side, there is an Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or the ICVCM, and their role is to essentially set thresholds through their core carbon principles for any carbon credits that are generated. And then on the demand side, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, is helping to establish guidance for corporates on the claims that are made when they are purchasing and then retiring credits as well. So since the VCS came online, there have been over 1,800 projects. I think we're maybe up to 2,000 projects at this point. A lot of carbon credits have been issued, and that's equivalent to the emissions of over 260 coal-fired power plants operating through the course of 1 year. So just to get into some of our current and emerging opportunities for CDR under the VCS, I'm going to highlight some within the coastal and marine environment, but really our work at Verra covers a wide variety of sectors. In terms of what we have for coastal CDR opportunities, right now those opportunities are focused on the restoration of coastal blue carbon systems such as mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrass. The removals are based on the creation or the management of wetland ecosystems to increase biomass and to also sequester additional carbon in the soil organic carbon pool below ground. We have the following methodologies that can be used to quantify the removals from these activities. So we have VM33, which is a methodology for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration. And then we also have restoration activities for coastal blue carbon captured under VM7. An example of a project that is using one of these methodologies is the Virginia Seagrass Project. This project is currently under validation by a VVB. They are using VM33, and they are doing seagrass restoration by seeding eelgrass in the Chesapeake Bay off of the eastern shore of Virginia. And so in addition to the removal benefits that this project is having, there are also some notable co-benefits in that this project is helping to attenuate wave action, which is important for local communities living in this area. And it's also providing additional nursery and spawning habitat for fish and other types of organisms. And this project is being implemented by the Nature Conservancy. In addition to these existing opportunities, we are also considering several emerging CDR opportunities in the marine space. All of these opportunities have been noted for their large potential for carbon sequestration in nearshore, open ocean, and then deep sea environments as well. The activities include things like seaweed farming, from nearshore environments all the way out to seaweed farming in deep ocean and then sinking that seaweed biomass so that it remains in those long-term pools. There are activities like ocean nutrient fertilization, artificial upwelling and downwelling, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and seabed management as well. And so these different activities are in varying stages of readiness to generate removal credits, but the potential is quite significant based on the latest in terms of the scientific literature. And so in order to support these newer activities, Verra launched an ocean carbon working group earlier in September of this year. And this group is aiming to identify and then develop updates to the BCS program in order to enable the crediting of these ocean-based project activities. And so just to kind of build off of that, essentially what this working group will do is update our BCS standards so that there are newer rules that take into account certain considerations around, for example, the permanence of these activities. And so we're going to be working with this group over the next 12 to 18 months to see what we need to do to update our program so that it can support these types of activities. So that's all that I have for you today. I think it's been a really interesting conversation so far and happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Thanks. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation, Liz, and really great to hear more about how Verra is approaching certification on the marine carbon removal front. I think something that's great about the differences that were expressed about what's happening for certification in a marketplace like Puro, what's happening about how Verra's moving methodologies forward for MCDR, and then Patricia's perspective on DAC and as a supplier. It shows that when we're talking about certification of carbon removal, we're not necessarily talking about one particular slice, but I think as the presenter showed, there's a larger conversation here playing out of how are we thinking about certification across the board, but that ends up being drilled down and more granular into some of the different opportunities and challenges that you were each speaking to. A couple of questions are coming into the chat, so this is also a good time for folks to, if you have questions for any of the speakers as they were sharing, feel free to add questions in the chat as one way to ask questions. I see a few coming in. If anyone prefers, you can also raise up your hand and I can call on you, we'll unmute you. Just as we're giving folks a minute to gather their thoughts and questions into the chat, I might just ask one question to the three of you to help kick off our Q&A portion of the presentations, which is, I think that each of your presentations did a really great job of talking about both the opportunities and the challenges both to date and that we're facing with and grappling today when it comes to certification and carbon removal, how important it is, what we're working through. This will play out over a period of years, but just at this point in November, with about 2 months to go before the end of the year, and as we look ahead to 2024, curious if there's any top line thoughts about where you see the conversations going, the big themes for certification and carbon removal going over the next year. Any big predictions or trends that you think we'll see? So it would be great to hear from each of you on that, and then I'm going to start calling out some of the questions coming to the chat. Thank you all for giving us questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can, and if we can't, we can look into doing some follow-ups after. But yeah, just as we're looking ahead, 2024, what are the big trends and themes we're going to be seeing in certification? Daniel, let's start with you.
Thank you, Ben. And I want to start by thanking Patricia and Liz. Great presentations. So I learned a lot in just these past 20 minutes. So trends for 2024, and I think, not only for 24, but ongoing, is the ICBCM application and accreditation process. Most standard setting organizations in the carbon market are going to try to apply for. We at Puro-earth not only support the ICBCM framework, but we are going to apply to it. We are doing all the necessary changes to our internal procedures in order to be compliant, and that is an ongoing certification discussion. I think the goal of the ICBCM is fantastic, which is to raise the bar in terms of certification quality and to standardize some of the procedures, which I think it's super important that we have common themes, common ways of accounting, measuring, thinking about the key issues of such as baseline determination, additionality assessment, risk of reversals, which are essential in the carbon removal space, and to have a common denominator that all the standard setting organizations will adhere to that ensures high quality, I think it's fundamental. And it adds another layer of trust. And at the end of the day, certification is not, you know, like just a label that you have and you're done. Certification is just several layers of processes that ensure that what the product is claiming to do is actually happening. And certification is not one thing. It's a layer of multiple processes, having independent processes, governance mechanism, independent bodies setting the rules, other independent bodies enforcing the rules. So this set of processes, as Liz very well explained in her slides, is what give you this final level of certification. And yes, this meta process with the ICBCM for all standard setting organizations is welcome, and I think will be the biggest trend, at least for early 2024, in terms of certification. I'll stop there.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate you laying out what you think the big trends are going to be for 2024. Thanks for sharing those insights, Daniel. Patricia, thoughts from you about where the certification conversations going in carbon removal as we look ahead to the new year?
Sure. And I think Daniel addressed this in his opening remarks. I think governments getting involved is going to be both helpful, and I think we'll see more of it over the next year. So, the U.S. Department of Energy has announced their kind of CDR purchase pilot. And I think part of that is to help be a part of this conversation as to what looks like a strong verifiable CDR removal credit, and how do they address that from a reporting standard. So, in so much as I've said, like, certainly our goal is not to see there be a bunch of different standards all around the world, from voluntary compliance markets and compliance markets, and in so much that hopefully governments kind of start stepping up and being part of that conversation, so that we could get increased standardization with that compliance market as well.
Great, thanks, Patricia. And Liz, your thoughts for 2024 trends and themes on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Daniel and Patricia said also completely agree with. Building off of Daniel's point on the ICBCM, I think that will continue to play a role over the next year as various standards put forward their program. So for example, Verra, we're putting our program forward for the CCP label and our methodologies as well. In addition, the ICBCM is going to be creating different methodological working groups to focus on particular areas and kind of continue to evolve those core carbon principles. So I think there will be even more evolution in that space, which will be interesting to see. I think we're going to see scale. I think this will just continue to grow. And so it's going to be important to keep up with that scale and keep up with these late technological advancements and whatnot. And then kind of building on Patricia's point around the role of governments and policy, I think it'll be interesting to see what policies, like what's been passed in the EU around these claims. I think that will be an interesting thing as well, and that will create a bigger role for groups like the BCMI as well on the buyer side of things. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Yeah, really appreciate that. I think it's good for folks to be on the lookout for not only where certification is fitting into the carbon removal equation, which I know you all touched on in your presentations, but then also what the particular trends and themes will be as we go into the new year. Building on Patricia's point about governments getting more engaged in the certification conversation, one of the questions that has come into the chat is for thoughts on the EU carbon removal certification framework that has been proposed and where that is. So if anyone has if any of our panelists has thoughts on that they want to jump in with and contribute, certainly welcome any reactions there.
Just very briefly, we at Puro-earth, having our headquarters in Finland, in Helsinki, we are deeply engaged with the European certification framework, and similar to what Liz is saying, not only at the program level, but at the methodology level, in terms of how the methodologies should look like for specific pathways of certification of carbon removal. And we do welcome, the state-driven intent on having standardized approaches on how to measure, verify carbon removal services in general. And I think that it's not going to be ready in the immediate term, but hopefully in a year time we can have further developments from this framework. But the stakeholder engagement that they have conducted, I think it's very important, and we appreciate it a lot.
Thanks, Daniel. Any other thoughts on the CRCF, Liz or Patricia, that you want to mention, or if there's any additional government calls you want to mention in general on other initiatives underway on certification? Feel free to mention that as well. Patricia, I see you off mute, so I'll go to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, obviously governments are also going to be inherently political. So in so much as we develop standards that, scientifically compare different CDR standards, and we give governments kind of those tools to, not kind of politicize CDR. And certainly even, I'm kind of looking through the questions, and, there are some questions about DAC, and is it really about kind of supporting the oil and gas community? And we certainly don't believe that's the case. We believe it's an important mechanism. Yeah, I mean, so I guess, just want to kind of highlight that hopefully these certification frameworks can help us, be really scientific in our approach to CDR rather than political.
Appreciate that, Patricia. And Liz, anything else that you want to add in on this question about the CRCF?
No, I think everything that's been said, I agree with. It'll be interesting to see how governments continue to engage in this space. And I think just broadly, I want to mention that, the role of the voluntary carbon market is to kind of fill in gaps that have been created by governments not taking action. So it will be interesting to see how things continue to evolve in the coming years.
Yeah, all great points. I appreciate the answers that touch on the role of government and certification more generally, and that Patricia was bringing the certification program that the recent Energy Department effort of procurement and what the certification will look like there, and appreciate all the commentary on the CRCF. I'll just quickly flag in on the CRCF in particular. I know some folks have had concerns that the CRCF isn't necessarily taking a tech neutral approach for how carbon removal is certified, and so that has raised some consternation, and there's more info online that we can drop in, but just flagging that as one additional piece. Seeing a lot of great questions come into the chat to shift things up a little bit, and also take a question from someone who has a hand raised. I'm going to unmute Avery to ask their question unmute yourself to ask your question. And folks should feel free to continue dropping questions in the chat. Great to see questions there. If anyone like Avery wants to jump in and ask question over Zoom, feel free to. So Avery, going to unmute you now.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, cool. I also asked this question in the chat, so yeah, feel free to ignore that. But this question was kind of on long-term storage. Liz, you were talking about the seagrass project, for instance, where you can imagine, I don't know, some type of environmental event changing the carbon that is stored by those seagrass. So I'm just wondering how all three of you think about like long-term storage of carbon, and if that's something that you continue to monitor, and if you have the rights to actually like penalize companies for re-emitting the carbon that they've been storing. Thank you.
Thanks. Great question, Avery. Appreciate you jumping in and asking it. I saw Daniel unmute himself first, so I'll go over to you, Daniel, to answer that.
Yeah, just briefly, I think this is a good example on how ICBCM is providing a common framework to understand the issue. And thank you, Avery, for your question. Basically, this framework has two different kind of solutions. Projects that have bigger likelihood of an event of reversal, which is exactly what you're mentioning, which is the carbon being re-emitted, and projects which have a lower likelihood of events of reversal. You can think of, for instance, mineralization of CO2 into concrete that has a very low likelihood of risk of reversal. And by separating these two frameworks, you have different actions on what you need to do on different projects based on this assessment of the risk of reversal. And then the actions will be project specific, methodology specific on what is going to be required for projects to provide. But in methodologies that have a higher risk of reversal, you will have risk mitigating measures and of course monitoring to make sure that the carbon is not re-emitted, and if is re-emitted, then you have compensation for that mechanism. I'll stop there, but I do want to mention that it is part of the framework, and thank you for your question.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Patricia?
Yeah, I mean, and for people who aren't kind of aware of Class 6 wells and geological sequestration in the United States, that has been a process that has been being developed for probably decades at this point, in collaboration between the US EPA and the Department of Energy. So there are very robust framework for companies getting the 45Q tax credits and what they need to report to the EPA, both on what's been stored to date and how they're doing their monitoring. So, for us and our projects, there's going to be our certification framework, and then there's going to essentially be this secondary process that's partially incorporated in our kind of certification framework, but also will be the Class 6 sequestration owners kind of reporting to the EPA. And, certainly there is, these are very technical solutions. I think sometimes people think about, it's just like a well site and there's just kind of CO2 being pushed in the ground, but there's complex kind of monitoring systems that are being built into these projects. There's fail safes that if the CO2 that, if it actually was to detect CO2 at the well site, it would automatically shut down the system, even though that has been proven to be kind of very, infinitesimally unlikely. So I would say, Class 6 wells are being very over designed to ensure the purity of the system, and that's all being reported back to the EPA. So there's this kind of secondary system, at least that's going on with kind of Class 6 wells in the United States.
Great. Yeah, Liz, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I just want to mention some of the processes that Verra has in place for what we call the risk of non-permanence. So we have a non-permanence risk tool, which projects must use to essentially evaluate the risk of a reversal. And so that includes an evaluation of financial stability, political stability, future impacts of climate change. And so based on that assessment, each project must then contribute an amount of credits into a buffer pool. And then in the event that there is some sort of a reversal, those buffer pool credits can be canceled to take that into account. And ICVCM, as Daniel has mentioned, is also kind of putting forward different concepts like that and requiring that in their core carbon principles. And then just one other thing on some new work from Verra to continue to monitor this into the future, we have a long-term monitoring system which we're bringing online, which will remotely monitor all projects. And so even beyond the project's crediting period, we'll continue to monitor the risk of reversal. And then if there is a reversal event, cancel those credits from our buffer pool.
Great. Appreciate all the answers there. And I think, once again, with the diversity of the perspectives that each of you bring to this as panelists, it's showing us that when we're thinking about the monitoring aspect of this, to look at the risk of reversal, that it's not one monolithic pathway. Monitoring for Class 6 storage might look different than some of the sites that Liz is talking about. And so I think that's good to be aware of as well. One question just that I meant to ask too, and Daniel was using it just because we've used the acronym ICVCM a couple of times, just if anyone's not familiar with who that group is, if Liz or Daniel, you don't mind just letting folks know so they can bring themselves up to speed.
Sorry, and this always happens that the knowledge gap is we're used to saying these acronyms, but it's a mistake. ICVCM is the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Market. ICVCM Integrity Council of the Voluntary Market Initiative. I think there is an initiative at some point. So basically, it is an organization that wants to serve as the voluntary standards, like a regulatory body for the voluntary market of standard setters. And there is a long history on how they came to be, but I do think that the framework that they have advanced is very powerful, and yes, we support it.
Great. Yeah, thanks for specifying that. Appreciate all the questions coming in. Gonna try and get another one or two, but recognize we're not going to be able to get to them all. Although folks should feel free to continue asking, because we might be able to do follow-ups after to try and get you your answers. And thanks so much for the active participation from everybody in the audience. It's great to see you jumping in with all of these. One question that came in, which I think is a good one, is about how can smaller carbon removal suppliers afford certification, and just a little bit on the range of costs. And we'll let each of our panelists unpack it. I think the cost of this is important. Like, what is the cost of doing business with this certification? How should we be thinking about it in the larger removals ecosystem? There's been some conversation about, should buyers be paying for the certification separately? As it included in the price of the ton? So this price of certification, especially with an eye as the way the question is asked, for smaller companies, is I think a good one. So curious to hear our panelists' thoughts around this.
I can start very briefly to say that in Puro's business model, we address this issue head on by only triggering our service fee when the actual credits are transacted and there is a buyer that actually purchased the credit for the supplier. So the supplier will only pay for the certification fee when they actually receive the money from the buyer. And this is a clear way of helping suppliers scale up their operations, because they don't have upfront costs on the certification. They will only pay for the certification, the service fee, when the buyer actually deposits the money for the payment of the credit. So we address this issue head on in our business model.
Great, I appreciate that. And Liz, I see you off mute if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and it's definitely a big challenge, I think, especially for these newer CDR opportunities. So some of those marine opportunities I was highlighting in my presentation, for example, a lot of those are still in the research and deployment phase. And so they're not even at the point of being able to generate a carbon credit, but it requires significant amounts of money to get to that point. And there's a hesitancy, I think, from buyers to invest in some of these newer technologies if they're not getting a credit out of it. But it's a very difficult space, because they can't come to one of these standards and then get any sort of buyer if they're not able to generate a credit. And so it's a bit circular, but something that we are trying to investigate is just encouraging these kind of upfront investments in that research stage to ensure the integrity of the eventual credits that do get generated. And we are seeing trends in price for removal credits that are significantly higher than other types of credits as well. And so hopefully that can help to offset some of those upfront costs.
Excellent. Great perspectives around the cost. Appreciate you bringing that up. Both the insight shared in the answer, and as well as the question that was posed. I think one theme that has come up in some of your remarks I want to go to for another question, which touches on this, is just to come back to this role of what voluntary carbon markets are doing in certification, what individual companies are doing, what governments are doing, what marketplaces are doing. I think there's this question of where is certification sitting with? And we talked about some trends already for 2024 and what will play out over the next year. But one of the questions in the chat is about the longer term arc of where this is going, which is just I'll read the question as it's stated, which is that as environmental markets, some practitioners have observed a two-step pattern of evolution. Voluntary certifications emerge and eventually lead to formation of government policies. And then the second stage of this is that adoption of illegal standards can diminish the role of voluntary standards. So for the carbon removal market, should we be expecting the private sector standards to be going away once the government is picking up the job? Will both continue in tandem? Is it going to be an ecosystem where there's multiple? I think what's been great is that we'll let you answer the question as it's been asked specifically about private sector standards and will that transition to government. I think what's been great about each of your remarks is that we've touched on all of the different areas that certification can sit, both in on the supplier side, on how buyers are thinking about it, marketplaces, how government. So you've highlighted, I think, that there's not necessarily one monolithic answer already, but just curious based on this question, if there's anything else you want to come to and highlight about where this might all go and what you see as the long-term role of government here.
I'll start briefly with that. So as I tried to convey in my initial remarks, the voluntary market, it can significantly grow, and we have seen estimations of a very powerful market cap in terms of the value that it can reach annually into the hundreds of billions of dollars even. But even if it reaches hundreds of billions of dollars, it won't be the silver bullet to have policy relevant climate action to reach the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So what I believe the voluntary carbon market can do is to show what is possible with robust certification and a business model that ensures that the buyer knows through certification that what they're buying is in effect, 1 ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere, stored for long durations of time. And the voluntary market has several advantages. It's faster since it's voluntary. You don't need to wait for the final guidance. In this case of a government to have a sign off, you can act and be at the forefront. And there are many companies at the forefront of this space using the voluntary carbon market to drive climate action. The thing is about scale, in terms of volumes, that will be difficult to achieve. And that is why governments, I do agree. And again, this is a little bit of fortune telling, but I do agree that it's conceivable that governments are going to be required to be the biggest players in this space for us to be able to reach the several gigatons a year of carbon removal that we need to reach the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. But the voluntary carbon market can help governments in drafting their policy, in seeing what is possible, and that is why I believe it's so important. This is not a good thing to do. This enables policy relevant climate action, the voluntary market. That's why we needed to succeed. We need robust certification in this market in order for it to succeed. I'll stop there. Sorry, too long.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate you sharing those insights, Daniel. Any additional thoughts from Patricia or Liz on that before we go to closing insights?
I think just very quickly, something I would add, agree with what Daniel laid out. Verra has existed since 2007. And I think since then, there was kind of this idea that eventually government would step in and take over for us. And that still hasn't happened. And now it's 2023. But I mean, I think we encourage governments to play more of a role in this because they have so much power and agency in bringing forward that regulation. I think the task at hand is so significant that we really need all the help that we can get. And a lot of what we've been doing more recently is actually engaging directly with governments to try to bring some standardization to the methodologies that they're using with the goals that they're setting.
Great. Yeah, appreciate that perspective, Liz. And Liz, while we're on you, we'll turn it to you and then go to Patricia and Daniel. Just for any closing remarks or additional insights you want to share based on either what other panelists have said or other points you want to drive home, just to leave folks with who have been joining us for our panel over the last hour plus. Just what are the key takeaways from you? Anything that you want to leave us with? And just on the time, I'll ask each of our panelists to keep it to a minute or less. So high level and brief closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Ben, and thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Daniel, for joining me on this panel today. It's been really great to learn from your perspectives, and it's always great for me wearing my coastal and marine hat to hear more about these technological interventions as well, because I do think, as I mentioned, the task at hand is so great. We need all of these types of activities to really get to where we need to go. And so I think just kind of building off of what I mentioned at the beginning, I really do think that the role of certification is so important so that any claim that is being made, you can actually feel confident that that removal is in fact occurring. And I think that there's, as Ben has mentioned throughout, it's not a monolith. There are different approaches to certification. I think there are certain pieces that we all agree on. For example, anything that's captured in the core carbon principles that are coming from ICBCM. I think that's something that we just need to continue to drive forward. And I'm excited to see what will happen in 2024 and see if any of our predictions do in fact come true. And thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time today.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. Patricia.
Yeah, and I'll echo, this has been a great presentation. It's fun when you can sit and talk to your colleagues and learn from them and, have this kind of fun discourse. And so I've appreciated learning from you always, Ben, and then Daniel and Liz as well. Yeah, and looking forward to kind of continuing to hear throughout the day. I mean, I think what we know and what the past decade has shown around the voluntary carbon markets is, as much as we all want to try to do the right thing, these are kind of hard tasks to accomplish, that there is so much variation in the standards. And, we've seen that can kind of create confusion and allow, certain players to abuse the system and create mistrust. So yeah, I don't know that I have kind of any great words of wisdom other than, looking forward to keep working with companies like Puro and Verra and others to, try to solve these problems.
Great. Thanks, Patricia. And Daniel, over to you.
Sure, and thank you, Ben, for this discussion. I have also enjoyed it a lot. Thank you, Liz, Patricia, and again to the Institute of Carbon Carbon Removal Law and Policy. I'll say that, just hammering down on the importance on certification. We have talked about, the importance for certification for the markets, for policy and growing the industry. But I want to end with the importance in terms of public opinion. Certification inherently involves the concept of transparency. And as we saw in the questions in the chat, there is a lot of skepticism by many citizens, many organized activists, environmental organizations about carbon removal in general. Certification is not only key for the market to grow, for the industry to grow, it is key to have the social license for this industry to operate into the future. So through certification, we can engage with these organizations, with the data, with the transparency in order to build trust with them for this industry to grow larger into the future. So I'll end with that, and thank you very much.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Daniel, Patricia, and Liz, for sharing such great insights throughout the last hour together. I think really great perspectives about why certification is so central to the market. And we'll turn it back to Will. Appreciate all of the great questions that came in. So thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here. And thanks again to the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy for organizing this. Looking forward to the rest of the discussions throughout the day. Will, thanks. And thank you all again.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. This was a great way to kick things off. I think we've teed up some of the key themes already in this context, right? And kind of the interesting interface of probably looming government regulation in this context, and its interaction with some of these voluntary efforts as we move forward. So really appreciate that discussion from all of you. We are going to take a brief break for about 3 minutes at this point. Start up back at 10:20 again. Our next panel, which is also on verification issues, will be a bit more prescriptive in its orientation and talk about some of the important issues, including notions of equity and justice and potential incorporation into some of the